Okay, I thought we were recording, but so wait me 1 second. Oh, we have Manuela. Hi, Manuela. Thank you for stepping in. And we just need to make a check whether we do have Spanish speakers and who are in need of Spanish interpretation for this PTA business portion of the meeting. So if you could just ask in our attendees, that would be wonderful. And we really appreciate you just pulling us out of the very difficult situation for this part of the meeting.
I'm happy to help. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Buenas tardes. Si hay alguien en esta reunión que necesita interpretación en español, por favor dígame y yo lo puedo asistir. Muchas gracias.
And you ask them if they could raise their hand if they do need interpretation.
Si necesitan interpretación, por favor levante la mano o hágamelo saber con su voz, cualquiera de las dos.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's see. Seeing none. We're having to improvise because our regular interpreter called sick this afternoon. And of course, we feel bad for her, but we needed to kind of scramble. So Manuela and then Crystal, who is logging in at 7:30, are helping us out. So I see no hands up, Manuela. So I think you are free to go. We have some work to do to make sure we have Spanish speakers here, obviously. So thank you so much and have a good night.
Happy to help.
Thank
See you
you.
next time.
Yeah, bye. Okay, so can people see my screen now? Meaning, can you see the standing rows?
Yes.
Thank you. Please, somebody tell me. All right. So the amendments that we have, I'm going to go over them fairly quickly because we've already reviewed them previously. This number 4, and if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask. There's a proposed amendment that's required by Washington State PTA. This one is how board of directors is determined. I will let people, we're going to try to vote on every one of them at the same time unless somebody wants to pull one, and then I'm going to ask for a vote for motion, etc. So I'm going to let people read this one first. Okay, so this is a brand new one that we can actually terminate people's membership if and there have been some cases that came up over the years that are really rare, but do come up that people need to protect their PTA and remove members. And this one is also amendment required by Washington State PTA. And basically, it's just moving to be number 2. So we're changing the numbers behind it. We're inserting that officers of this PTA shall be elected for a 1-year term. An officer may not serve more than 2 consecutive fiscal years in the same office. An officer having served 8 or more months in the same fiscal year shall be considered to have served a full year. This is something that's actually been in the bylaws, but we need to add it to our standing rules. Any questions? Seeing none. There is a proposed amendment about, no, this one is except for nominating committees. So we would be basically adding in that president shall be a chairperson of the board of directors, the executive committee, and of the general membership meetings. And the president is an ex officio of non-voting meetings, non-voting member. That's an old, this just clarifies that nominating committee is an exception, that president is not an ex officio member of that committee because there's a conflict of interest. It's just clarification. Next one is we are adding online banking because hooray, we don't have to do everything with a check anymore, which was a requirement for all PTAs in the state. So we are basically saying that PTSA may access online banking to review and download monthly bank statements, conduct financial transactions. We may accept payments and using online sites and in-person devices, PayPal, Square, etc. We can do online banking now. And we need to, apologies, my cat just climbed on a shelf and knocked down a bunch of stuff. So welcome to my two-cat household. So we will have to develop create and develop written procedures and internal controls for conducting online banking to minimize the risk of misappropriations of funds. This is actually approved by the board of directors, but it does have to be recorded in the standing rules. Next amendment, excuse me, new one is membership meetings may be held in person, virtually, or via hybrid meeting, or both. Virtual or hybrid meetings must use remote communication tools where all participants in person or virtually have equal opportunity for simultaneous participation, voice, and vote, right? So we need to make sure that we're not just, if there's a meeting that's in person, that the people online are not just listeners, they are actually participants. So that's what it is. Any questions? If you have questions, please raise your hand and somebody hopefully will tell me because I'm not watching all the hands. But next one is we are proposing to rename the Article 8 instead of letters to rename it advocacy. And the change would be because this article is actually not just about signing onto letters. It is about advocacy as a whole. So that's just to clarify. The next one, I think there's a couple more. So this one, we would like to strike the communications that are sent out to the public must be reviewed by at least 2 board members prior to approval. And this was very restricting, slowing down and adding too much work for the communications chair. So what we are asking the membership to approve is that the communication committee chair or co-chairs or their designees may post on the Seattle Special Education PTSA social media and in the newsletter as long as the communication is in alignment with the committee's strategies and goals and with the PTA's vision, mission, and general ethical standard. Any member of our PTA may propose and submit information to be communicated out to the board for review and approval by at least board members or the communications committee chair or co-chairs who may approve the submission without approval from an additional board member. So we're removing, it's a kind of a hard language, but we're removing the extra step of 2 board members approving what the communications chair does, basically. Any questions? No. Okay, the next, I think the next one is we are trying to add this PTA may collaborate with non-PTA organizations. This is according to Washington State PTA. The PTSA will handle only PTSA funds and will have in place a signed contract with other organizations to clearly establish whether it is a PTSA activity or the other organization's activity. The PTSA will not be a fiscal agent, fiscal sponsor, or sign a sponsorship or charter agreement with any outside organizations or agencies. So this is about affiliation with the Washington State PTA. Any questions about that? No, and then the number 6 is changing to number 7. We're just renumbering it. So if anybody is able to make a motion, I'm running through this. Sorry.
This is Mel. I'll make a motion that the standing rules are passed with the proposed amendments.
I second that motion. This is Laura Marie.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, any debate? Any questions? Seeing none, all in favor, please I'm going to ask that people put their yay or yay into the chat just
Thank you so much.
just so we can track it better. We're gonna need at least 10 people. So if you are a member,
I'm on my phone. This is Mel. I'm sorry. I'm on my phone trying to find the chat thing. It's just hard to
That's
do on the
okay.
phone.
That's okay.
But I vote yes.
Yeah, okay, gotcha. Okay, I cannot vote, so we need to make sure we have 10 members voting and approving this. 'Cause
Sorry, I'm super new to PTSA. This is Laura Rose. To just any kind of PTA world. Does any member vote, or is this just for like board members?
No, any member. If you're a member of this PTA, you get to vote.
Okay, then
You
I vote
can-
yes.
Fantastic. I would like to get these passed so that we can be in compliance, and you can even join the PTA right now during the meeting. If you would like to, if anybody has the give backs link, you can put it in the chat. That'd be great. Because otherwise we're gonna have to review them again in February and approve them again. And that would be the 3rd time, so please. I'm a member. Okay. Yeah, that doesn't count. You have to be member of this PTA to vote on our business. But you can become a member of this PTA. You can be a member of any number of PTAs if you'd like. All right, I'm really hoping. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
And Kate and I both put it in the chat.
I saw that. Yeah.
And Laura Rose did too as well. Yay.
Yeah. It doesn't look like we have enough people, unfortunately. So we will have to, the motion can't pass unless.
Can we extend the voting till Cheryl Lynn gets here?
Yeah, we can, but we have 6 so far. So we could probably revisit this. We could table this and then try again, but we might not have time because we need to get to our speaker, right? But we do need to review and amend the legislative priorities. So Mel, do you think you could get a couple of minutes and just tell us about the legislative
Sure.
priority?
Yep.
Thank you.
This is Mel, I'm gonna get it up on screen. Hold on a second. So at our last couple meetings, we tried to get this passed as well. And if we don't have the votes now, I don't know if we're gonna be able to do it again. Do you wanna still review them again, Yana? Even though we don't have quorum?
Yeah, if you don't have a quorum,
Yeah,
yeah. I can see that. Yep.
so let's save time with that then and just.
Let's
skip
just
until we have-
move on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's what we have to do, and we might need to call a special meeting to approve these.
Okay,
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Mel. I think that I'm just going to announce that the next legislative advocacy meeting is next week on the 20.
it's
29th.
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 Yep, Wednesday, 29th at 12 o'clock. It's a virtual meeting. That meeting is on our Facebook. It's on our calendar on our website. So join us if you can. Otherwise, I am going to hopefully find RJ. I see you. And I'm going to make you a co-host, RJ. Welcome for being here. Welcome. Thank you. Welcome. And thank you for being here. Just putting it all together in the rush. So if you could just, I will probably, I have introduced you in the beginning before we had you. So I would like to just hand it to you and you can introduce yourself and take it away. We are all excited to hear about multi-tiered systems of support. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Yana. I am just going to go over here real quick and just double checking you can see my screen now. You get a thumbs up from someone that they can see?
Yep, we can see
I
you.
can see.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, as Yana said, I do work for OSPI. My name is RJ Monton. I'm the director of MTSS there. And as we sort of dive in this evening, I just wanted to say, like, I am super appreciative of you all allowing me to kind of crash your meeting. A multi-tiered system of supports is my favorite topic to talk about. I'm excited to be talking to the PTSA or the Special Education PTSA here in Seattle about it. So I think it's always important when I connect with folks to let them know sort of where I've been and why I talk about things the way I might, just because my path in education's not necessarily traditional. So I did start in New Hampshire in a role as an outdoor educator. However, it was at a residential school that served students who all received special ed services and had some pretty intensive behavioral support needs. So that was where I started my career and moved and stayed in special education for quite a while, both at that school in a K-4 classroom and then before moving to Washington and beginning to teach high school in a local school district out here. At that district, moved through sort of a teacher on special assignment position, which was around MTSS work, primarily in the field of behavior, and then into an administrative role. So first special education administration, and then sort of behavioral health support. So ultimately looking at those preventative supports for students. And then I joined OSPI on the tail end of the pandemic, doing statewide work around MTSS. And so my communication with Yana, we were back and forth with some emails, and I tried to pull out the high points that she was sharing and some of the community questions and those concerns that were popping up from folks, as well as some of I'll try to address some of the misunderstandings around a multi-tiered system of supports. I've organized this the best I could tonight into kind of 4 buckets. And after the first 2, since they're a bit heavier, I'll pause for questions so we don't have to wait till the very end for questions. But then the next 2 kind of go together, that MTSS and special education services, and then the 2028 legislation that I'm sure many of you have kind of heard about. And then finally at the end, I'll hold time for anything or questions I may not have addressed, and I'll do my best to answer them. As a side note, I know that there are often specific questions around personal experiences, and for the record, I don't sit on any IEP teams. I don't sit on intervention teams, and I don't work for Seattle Public Schools. So there's a lot of nuances in those situations that I can't comment on. I don't know all the details behind it, and I just don't want to put out there like a false idea that I might be able to provide guidance on those situations simply because I don't know the details behind it. So just want to make sure that that's understood. But I will be talking about how MTSS is supposed to be used and how it isn't supposed to be used, or how it's often misused. And hopefully I'll be able to clear up some misconceptions around it in that process. So let's start, let's dive right in. It's really, really easy to get lost in the acronyms. Like, all of the letters out there can be really confusing. They can be overwhelming. And I'm going to use some of them tonight just so that you all have the definitions and then have the tools to be like, okay, cool. Now I understand what this means. I understand the context behind it. So I at least want to leave you with the definition behind some of these acronyms floating around. But these are all, so a multi-tiered system of supports is a framework, and I think it's best to start there. So what the framework is ultimately it's there to help educators be the most effective with their expertise and their limited time, right? We know a school day is only so long, a school year is only so long, and a multi-tiered system of supports allows those experts in the classrooms to be the most effective with their time with students. And we know that students really benefit from this robust framework because it sets the effective conditions for the adults to organize and be the most effective, right? It sort of sets the rules. It becomes the playbook for the adults in the system to provide those supports for students. Some of those key components are there on this graphic. They're the ideas behind like putting these systems together, incorporating those with the classroom practices, and using data, like whether it's qualitative or quantitative, so whether it's numbers or just it's observational and dialogue, using that to make decisions around the intensity of supports for students. So so just not just using the script, but looking at like, okay, this is how students are responding to instruction. Here's how I, as the adult, the teacher in the classroom, am going to change my instruction to the student response. So it combines these to provide sort of that equitable experience for all students. Okay. From a landscape perspective, as I was saying, it combines these ideas as systems, practices, and data, right, for that equitable experience. And we need to make sure that we're careful with our words when I talk about acronyms here. There's an MTSS, or a multi-tiered system of supports, and our multi-tiered system of supports. So if we start with the latter, so our MTSS indicates that there's been some locally determined framework, locally meaning like the school district, the region, or even a state, right? So there's national frameworks as well. So our MTSS is what we define as like that local context, okay? And that matters because no two districts are the same, right? Seattle has a different population, different educational needs, different needs across, I think it's 105 schools, 105 buildings. That's a lot. Different setup when you think about Spokane, or even different needs in Lake Washington, or even the far south end of the state. If you look at Roosevelt, a school district that has, I think, 35 students right now. So different scales of economy, different student needs. So a locally determined multi-tiered system of supports is going to look different in different contexts. Okay, so there are multiple tiered frameworks, and I apologize in advance for all the acronyms, but I think it's helpful to understand. So we've heard things before like response to intervention, or PBIS, which is positive behavior interventions and supports, and then there's also interconnected systems framework. These are all different versions of a multi-tiered system of support. And what happens is researchers have drawn a circle around a certain part of a greater MTSS framework. So those purely academic and intervention focused folks have drawn their circle around those pieces, and it's called RTI, or response to intervention. So it's really that multi-tiered framework that has a distinct focus on those academic supports and interventions. PBIS, or positive behavior interventions and supports, those researchers and that body of work and that body of evidence has really drawn that circle around those social emotional behavioral supports, right? So those typically thought of as non-academic supports. All the research in PBIS is focused on that. And then the newer emerging one that's out there, this is interconnected systems framework. This takes on that behavioral health supports, or the social emotional behavioral supports, and it sort of extends the idea into the community, right? It thinks about how can we incorporate community providers in a more fluid model within buildings, or outside of buildings. So how do we take the expertise of local behavioral health supporters or behavioral health supports and incorporate that into the building so that we as a school district don't have to design a parallel model, right? So how do we leverage that expertise? And that body of research is just there's been a circle drawn around that. So folks are looking at the effectiveness of those practices. But ultimately, these all rely on a multi-tiered framework. And I'm going to dive into what that multi-tiered looks like in a little bit. Now in Washington, so we have a greater framework, right? Think of these as like those Russian nesting dolls, right? So that like the closer you get to the student, the more we're thinking about those practices, the further we're thinking about systems. So within Washington, the framework was developed by staff, several different teams at OSPI, and we worked with other community providers and other state partners in the work. And it was based on a wealth of national research. We're not the only state moving forward with efforts like this. There are 48 other states who are working towards this. But it builds on this public health approach that's preventative in nature. So when I say public health, think of the idea behind like cold and flu season, right? So if everyone washed their hands, like and kept clean hands or stayed home when they were sick, wore a mask if they were sneezing or coughing. If we prevented the spread of germs, we'd have less people getting sick, right? So it's based on that public health approach where we're preventing the spread of something. However, flipped into the educational world, we're preventing students from not having access to what they need. So we're maximizing what we can do for every student when they walk through the door. Beyond prevention goes intervention, right? So the idea that like, okay, we know there's a certain time of year when cold and flu season happens. Like if we all got a flu shot, maybe that would help prevent us at least from last year's strain and we'd be less likely to get the flu. So it's sort of an advanced effort. Oh, Yana, I see your hand, yeah.
Yeah, this is Yana. I just want to ask if you could slow down a little bit for our interpreters so that they can catch up.
Absolutely. No, I thanks for that. I am from New England and I drink a lot of coffee and it's
And
late
you're
in the day,
clearly
so
passionate about it.
no, I appreciate that. And then sort of the most intensive support in that public health model would be that individual care, right? So we know that some people still get the flu pretty bad and they have to go get pharmaceutical support. So something like Tamiflu to support them to get through those times. So in Washington, we've divided sort of our efforts around spreading multi-tiered system of supports across the state into 5 sort of categories or components. Now, these are not separate, they're interconnected, but we needed a way to sort of categorize and bucket them in order to support districts and building in their efforts. So it's those 5, that team-driven shared leadership, right? There's not one person in charge of it. We share that effort. We've got to be using data to make decisions. Our continuum of supports there is made up of evidence-based practices, right? We need to be using tools that have evidence to actually support what we're trying to do, right? We're not just making things up. And finally, that family, student, and community engagement. And that's where I think might be the most important for this group to sort of consider this evening. How do families and districts engage with each other to help promote the most robust framework that they can at the local level? Now, a multi-tiered system of supports isn't necessarily the thing that we're sitting down. We're not teaching students about it. We are teaching staff about it because it's sort of their playbook. But we have these 14 different bills and guidance and policy and all these, and it's legislative session. So there's a lot of things referencing existing policies. So there's 14 different basically bills or guidance that reference a multi-tiered framework or say like you must do this, or schools or districts, you must engage in this, leveraging a multi-tiered framework. You'll notice there is no bill or guidance around MTSS. And that's sort of because MTSS isn't necessarily a thing any two districts can do the same way. Like I said at the onset, there's different scales of economy and there's different needs at the local level. Things are going to be designed differently, right? What works in Seattle is not going to work in Northport and vice versa. So the way I guess I'd like you to all consider MTSS is sort of like, you know, we at this point many of us have a smartphone, right? Whether it's an iPhone or like an Android, or I think there's a Google phone. There's a few out there. It's like the operating system in the background, right? It's that thing that you don't necessarily see, but you're super appreciative of because it makes all the other apps work seamlessly together, right? And if we think back, I think back to like the original iPhone, like it was just called iPhone. It wasn't even iPhone 1. I remember a friend of mine had it and he was trying to make it work and he wanted speech to text to work on it, but he needed a different app to do it and it was clunky and it didn't translate it the right way. And it wasn't as seamless, although it was still a pretty significant advancement in cell phone technology. But that speech to text piece didn't really work that great. And now, like if you think about, you know, that operating system they've looked at it and said, like, okay, cool. What's the user experience supposed to be? If we're all that end user, we provide feedback with like every time we sign that service agreement with them, we provide that feedback about what we like and what we don't like, and they update the operating system. Now speech to text is built into the phone and to the point where it's even voice recognition, where if I said the right two words out loud, my phone's going to light up and it's going to say, what do you need? That's similar to an MTSS framework, right? So the idea is that like we look at how we're supporting students and it continuously improves. Because if we think about it, even the context of a kindergarten through fifth grade through an elementary school, you know, your fifth graders leave at the end of every year and you get new kindergartners every year. So what you have existing right now, you might have different needs next year depending on the kindergartners coming in, right? Or there may be environmental factors. We could have a pandemic. Something could cause a disruption in the normal functioning of a school, and we might have to shift and change. So our frameworks need to be built to support all students, but they also need to be built in the way that they're fluid. And that's where that data piece and that systems and the practice come together to allow the educators to quickly respond to changes in either environment or student need to adjust the framework, much like the operating system on your phone, right? As things change, we need to change how it all works, okay? And the other piece, these next two slides, and then I know we'll take a break for some questions. This is the higher level stuff too. We'll get into the stuff that sort of irritates me as much as it probably irritates you about P12 education. But in this model, we have these, like we call them building implementation teams. So these are the teams that are looking at their frameworks and trying to install them and improve them, right? So that ultimately implementation is like using something at that level. So the building teams are doing this and they're looking at, okay, what do our students need? How do we maximize what we can do for all students so that we're not trying to individualize too much? Then we get into looking at district teams. And they're like, okay, we've got this many schools. How do we maximize what we're doing to provide professional development, technical assistance, and all of that coaching support for our buildings? How do we make it so that the teachers can do their job the most effectively? All right, so districts are kind of looking at that. Or how do we like, oh, we have a pocket of excellence over here. How do we scale and spread that across the district? That's what those teams are looking at. And then the further you get away from the actual classroom, the more you're looking at the system, right? So regional teams or your educational service districts, which are, if you're not familiar, there's 9 of them in our state and they support their local districts. Seattle's is right here in Puget Sound ESD in Renton. So they're like, okay, looking at all of our districts, how do we make sure that we have the ability to train their trainers essentially, or provide them with the newest support for the most recent state guidance, okay? And the same thing at the state level. Where our role is a bit more advocacy and how do we get funding to districts to support them in the best way possible. I saw your hand, Yana. Did you have a question?
I was gonna wait for the questions. Thank you for.
Okay. Yep. And then there's just that piece where I was talking about, we have practices on one side. So if I'm a teacher in a classroom in a multi-tiered framework, my focus is primarily practices, right? I have those students in front of me, and I'm trying to maximize, my training and look at how do I provide for the unique needs that they all have in the classroom at any given time. I'm not ignoring the systems piece though, because if I come up to like, oh, holy cow, I have a student who has a need that I haven't yet been trained for, I need to rely on the system to support me to support that student. Or if it's an intense need, then we're talking about the idea of having someone else come in and support. So that's the contextual focus on that end. So close to the student, thinking about those practices. The further you get away, so in my case, my role is primarily looking at the systems, right? How do we make sure that all of the technical assistance any provider in the state is providing speaks the same language, right? Because we could have multiple providers in one district supporting them, and if they're saying the same thing different ways, it gets confusing. So supporting cleanliness or effectiveness of the system tends to be my role, but you'll also notice that there's still a piece of practices in there, right? So if we're looking at, here's an emerging practice that we see as having success somewhere, it's on myself and the team that I work with to be like, okay, how do we get that more places that need it rather than just in this one pocket? How do we celebrate what's been happening and what a local district did or a school did, and help that be a model for some other places? Not necessarily the what they're doing, but how they got there, because as I said before, the context matters. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so I've said a lot, I've talked a lot, but just to recap, I talked about what a multi-tiered system of supports is, super high level. It is that organizing framework for adults, right? It requires that combination of the systems, practices, and data, and in context can be looking at social emotional or behavioral health components, or those more purely academic components, and it could include some community resources. And it's that balancing of support infrastructure and practices, and ultimately it's like I said, it's that iOS or that operating system for the adults in the system. So I'll pause. I can answer a few questions before we get into the next.
Maybe we could ask if anybody has questions first before I ask my question. So feel free to raise your hand. You can also, and then you can unmute. And if you are having trouble raising your hand because, not everybody is tech savvy, then you just unmute yourself and ask. That's totally fine. All right. Well, so far, I think you're covering everything, RJ. I do have a question, and I also want to acknowledge that we have Executive Director Devin Gurley here tonight, Executive Director of Special Education attending. So we always love to see you and welcome you here, and we appreciate you being here and at this hour, at such a late hour. And I did have a question, and maybe you can just stop me and say, okay, I'm going to talk about it later. There's one. Could you give some examples of what the supports are? Number two, what are trainers? Who are trainers? And I would love to know if Director Gurley can answer whether we have them. Who are they? Do we know about them? How would we know about them? What do they do? I don't know. A little bit of like, how does that translate into our district, I guess? Or what's the expectation? That would be very helpful.
I will touch on some of that specifically. And I did say trainers, but I will say that it's also, what I should have said is training. It's not necessarily always a person. So in some cases, that's the principal as the principal educator in a building. They might be providing that training for staff. So training as a verb, not necessarily trainers as a noun. So I'll correct myself on that one.
And then maybe Director Gurley can, this is Yana, sorry, Director Gurley can tell us what that looks like in SPS briefly.
Sure. This is Devin Gurley. And so one thing I sent to Yana and that she can share with you all is the presentation that I did to the School board audit committee around one of the partners we're using for this support. It was called Novak Education. They did an extensive needs assessment in 2023 around MTSS practices in our school district. So what they found and what we know is essentially that MTSS is operating in some form in every school. However, what MTSS looks like in every school varies significantly. Some schools understand a true MTSS process. Some schools treat it a lot like a referral for intervention, which is not the spirit of MTSS. It's really thinking about those proactive supports. So one of the things that we've noticed kind of in our leadership team is that we've had 3 to 4 different iterations of MTSS rollouts from the central leadership over, gosh, probably 15 years. And so it's important for us to really start at the center. So I've been working really hard with our regional executive directors, often called REDs, with the rest of our student supports team and the academics team to provide a lot of training and support to them, get us all moving in the same direction. And then we have early adopter schools where each of those principals has a coach from Novak that is coaching them on the leadership moves and practices around strong MTSS systems in their buildings. We've had some successes. We know that large systems change takes 5 to 8 years. And so one of the things that we've been really looking at is, okay, what are our initial results? How are we using those results to inform our next steps, whether we have to make changes, whether we want to keep going with certain things. And so as a general overview, that's kind of where we are right now. So we have varying levels. We have a lot of staff who have been trained. Schools, especially the early release schools, are doing, or sorry, the early adopter schools are doing early release days as their MTSS focuses. And then one of the things that the coaches are doing from Novak with the principals is having them really pick between, 2 to 3, no more than 5 high leverage MTSS practices to start with, so that they can really think about doing an assessment of their building. What do they maybe have that's strong? What needs to be in place? And what are those foundations that are needed for the next steps? Because we know if we try to do it all at once, it's just not going to be successful. So that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of supporting. We also provide training and support through our instructional summit in the summer for all educators interested in taking our classes.
Awesome. So I saw some questions in the chat, and I can definitely speak to one in a little bit around like the rationale across the state, is like as far as our state scale up effort, what that looks like, and why it looks the way it does. I understand that, Caroline, I see your question, and I'll address that the best I can without getting too technical and techy on it. But so go ahead, Yana.
This is, so we just need to make sure that we read out loud the questions. I was just uploading the slides that Devin shared. So I wasn't able to get to that, but we need to make sure we are reading those questions out loud so people know what is being said, because not everybody is watching the chat or, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I will. When I get back to Caroline's question, or Caroline, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. When I get back to your question, I'll read it out loud before addressing it. Yana, you had asked about specific interventions and supports, and I'll touch on that sort of in different pieces here when I talk about this continuum of supports. So this is one of the 5 key components of focus within an MTSS frameworks. Specifically in Washington, we call it out as a specific component. It's probably, if any of you have sort of like dabbled in some of this, you've probably seen this triangle, like, and it's sort of this idea, and it's been around quite a while, but it's based again on that public health model, right? what we have is like tier 1 supports that for all students, tier 2 and tier 3 supports for students who need something in addition to those tier 1 supports. So when we think about this, you know, the continuum of supports is that instruction, right? Enrichment intervention support for not only those academic needs, but the social, emotional, and behavioral supports, right? They're all culturally and linguistically responsive interventions, right? They're targeted for the students that need it, or they're provided in a way that it's accessible for all students. And when we talk about these tiers, we're describing the intensity of the supports provided. We don't label students as a tier 2 student. We don't label staff as a tier 2 staff or a tier 2 provider. Ultimately, everyone works across this continuum and students receive supports across the continuum. All right, and all students should have equitable access to that tier 1 support. So if there's something that your local site is offering, saying like, yep, this is universal, this is tier 1, and for some reason a student doesn't have access to it, it requires some looking at to either improve access or make it accessible, or maybe say like, oh, maybe that's not actually a tier 1 support we're providing to everyone. So there's that's a key part of it, is it has to have universal access, right? So if we're going to dig into these a little bit deeper, so like I said, those tier 1 supports are the foundation, right? So these are foundation for behavior, academics, social emotional support. So this is your curriculum, right? This is something that like, okay, this is the curriculum we're using. It's accessible for all students, you know, regardless of ability. This is a universal support. Or these are our school's behavioral expectations, and we teach them so students know how, like, they know the expected behavior in this setting. And we not only do we teach them, but we reinforce them. And every single student has access to that reinforcement. Every single student has access to the instruction. So that is a universal support in a building, right? So it's sort of like the idea of like ramps for mobility impairment, like you know, different supports for visually impaired, you know, different supports for hearing impaired. So this idea, like, all right, if we're calling it a universal support, it's there for everyone. It's accessible for everyone. Those supports in a healthy framework, whether they're academic or behavioral or social emotional, like they should be enough, so like for at minimum 80% of the students in that population to be successful with those supports alone, right? That's a healthy system, right? The goal is 100%, right? We always want the system to be perfect for all students, but we recognize, like I said, that changes every year. The students coming in, the students leaving, so we have to be responsive, and it's not immediate. Public education has not gotten that good yet. So we expect that, like, all right, 80% of our students should be successful, academic and behaviorally, with those core supports alone. Okay, so we know, and those supports are what the teachers are providing. So some examples: standards-based curriculum instruction, right? So that should be accessible to all students and should be enough for 80% to be successful alongside their peers. Basic interventions. So these are things, these are sort of those teacher moves in the classroom, right? Like a teacher is providing instruction, they see that a student either needs something that's more enriching to stay engaged, or they need something to close a knowledge gap to stay engaged. This is like in the moment, teacher's like, oh, I got a tool for that. They use the intervention that supports the student right away. This is all core stuff. Nothing special has to be done. A teacher just uses their teacher knowledge and makes the adjustment as they're instructing. Maybe not in that minute, but over the course of a unit, over the course of a quarter, or however it's broken up, they're making those adjustments in their practice to support all students. So those basic interventions are part of core instruction. And then that preventative education, right? So all students should receive the same support around the positive mental health, substance use prevention. These are all things that are supported for all students, right? And then again, those behavioral expectations, right? Like generally how we're supposed to behave in school, in a classroom, that should be taught and that should be reinforced, okay? So there's the trend, right? Accessible by all, like, and should be working for at least 80% minimum, okay? Oh, yes, Yana.
Yeah, can you give us examples? What could that be at each level? You don't have to say every single piece, but what are the supports that would be at this level?
At tier 1?
Yeah, each tier.
Oh yeah, so the support, like, so tier 1 is like that guaranteed curriculum, right? Everyone has access to it, and from a district perspective, the school perspective, the teacher should be trained to use it, right? So it's, if we think about the idea of that support being an evidence-based practice, right? So if we're using a math curriculum, right? If I'm sitting there and I'm instructing 5th grade class, you know, we're looking at math, I'm instructing them, I should have had the training as a teacher, right? I have my teacher prep, but also I whatever curriculum the district is choosing, I should have that. I should also have some basic knowledge to look at, like, oh, I'm instructing, and that universal support that I should have access to is like, oh, student A has a computation error. Like, quickly I can provide them with some discrete instruction. Now they're maintaining with their peers because they have a new tool to use. So it's the curriculum, and it's sort of the flexibility on the sides of the curriculum for me as a teacher to fill knowledge gaps. Or I have the student who is sort of like, I know this already. I'm like, cool, like, you've done the work, like, you're going to apply it to a novel concept, right? So allowing that student who has maybe some advanced knowledge or advanced learning to take the same concept and extend it further in the classroom, so that they're not engaging in, we'll call it disruptive behavior or distracting behavior, because they, like, I already know how to do this part. Okay, we'll apply it to this concept over here. So it's those are skills as a teacher that I can apply in the moment, and that's all tier 1 supports, right? That's not anything I need special permission to do. I don't have to fill out a form. I don't need to make a call home. It's just like, cool, yep, I see this in the moment. I can make that change. I'm going to skip tier 2 on purpose, and I'm going to come back to it because tier 2 is a harder one to kind of talk about. Tier 3 supports, so like the top of our model here, are supports that we typically, they're individualized, right? So we have a student with a unique need, and we're like, okay, this student, we need to provide them with something that we need to build specifically for them, or combine a bunch of supports in a specific way for them so they can access the curriculum, right? They have the tier 1 supports, and now they need like a specific tier 3 support, right? Something individualized for them, okay? Some examples of this, we think about the idea of like, okay, a student who might have a lagging skill set in reading, okay? They're 4th grade and they still have some decoding. They still have some decoding needs. They may need some one-on-one or really small group, but individualized support around decoding, okay? We try to do this in a way where we don't remove them from access to the curriculum, because we want them continuing with the comprehension pieces. They may be able, with other supports and accommodations, if they're listening rather than reading, they may be able to continue with the comprehension piece, but we need to do some sort of support with them specifically around decoding. So that's an individualized support, right? We do something specifically for a student for an individual need in that moment, okay? The thing about these supports, anything beyond tier 1, is ideally they're not permanent, right? So the idea is like, okay, if we can do some intensive support around decoding, we can close the gap for the student and then they can maintain, right? They can jump back in full time with their peers, or they don't need that support anymore because they've figured out that piece of decoding and they're maintaining in that language arts class, okay? Or that after that individualized support, maybe they just need a little bit a lesser intense support, and we could fade from that intensive one-on-one or that intensive time demand on that support. So again, the tier 3 supports aren't really designed to be permanent. Okay, we know that there's some students who have, and some students who have a disability. We know that disabilities don't go away, and some tier 3 supports are around longer. Okay, or sometimes they are permanent. You know, a very individualized need. When we think about some students with communication needs, whether it's some augmented communication has to be specifically designed for them. Yes, Yana.
This is Yana. We have a question in the chat that how are we identifying successful for the 80% of the tier 1 supports, meeting grade level standards or showing some level of access to the curriculum? That's one question. And then I want to piggyback on the tier 3, because I mean, I keep hearing a lot of the supports that are academic, but I want to also touch base on what would where would, for example, counseling, this mental health counseling fall, or transportation, or whatever it is that the student might need for behavioral supports, not just academics, because I mean, we hear a lot that, you know, student has good grades and they don't need X, Y, and Z support. But we're not looking at it whether, you know, the student, what their attendance is, or whether they're having a challenging time with peers, or what it is that is making the accessibility of the education overall, not just academics, you know, appropriate for them. So I would like to know if you have any of that, but I think that this is a, you know, what is successful? I would like to know the definition if there is one too. Yeah, we would like to.
Yeah, so like the 80% that successful piece. So that's that. Oh, I'm gonna get to that in a few slides, and it'll make sense. After I can talk about tier 2, I can flip around and we'll talk about like where that 580, that 520, 100, like we'll talk about that.
That's great. But I think if you could, this is Jana, if you could just
Yep.
tell us like what are the intensive and individualized supports as like not in academic area too, that would be expected that the district would provide.
I'm going to give you the worst answer possible, but it's the truest answer. It depends. And because the continuum of supports, and I'll talk about this at the end, is completely contextual. Meaning what a tier 3 support is going to depend on what those, like what 1 and 2 look like in that setting. And I say this because when I taught in New Hampshire, we had a framework, right? Everyone was like, oh, you teach at a residential school, that's like tier 27. Like, no, there's three tiers. Our local context, we had students with pretty intensive behavioral needs. Our tier 1 was made up of a lot of things that you would not see in public school. So when you say like, what does it look like at tier 3? I'm gonna say it depends.
So for public school, can you
Yep.
specifically, what's the expectation overall,
Yeah,
general?
and I'm not pushing back, but I'm saying like I also worked when I moved out here in an alternative school within a public school district, and the students there had pretty intensive behavioral health needs. More students were receiving counseling, so it was a bit more of a tier 2 support because that's what our population demanded that we provide. Okay. More often than not, a tier 3 support is going to look like some sort of like in the behavioral health world will look like some sort of referral for individual support, whether that's in the district or out of the district. Is going to depend on the specific need of that support. So that'll be locally determined by a process. Okay. And when I said at the very beginning, we had this interconnected systems framework that's developing. Some schools have partnerships with local mental health, behavioral health supports. Sometimes they come in the school, sometimes it's in some settings it's right across the street, and they have systems worked out where the student goes across the street. So my answer, and it depends, it kind of depends. Specific to some of the behavior we see in the classroom, we think about a tier 3 support is we're thinking of like sort of behavior plans at this point. And mostly the behavior plan is the script of how we want to get the adults to behave a little bit differently to help a student understand like, okay, when this trigger happens or when you feel like this is the path we'd like you to go down. Meaning like this is how like we can teach them to ask for help in a certain way, or teach them to take a break in a certain way, or access attention in a certain way, versus the interfering behavior that may not be working for them in the classroom. Okay.
Jana, when you say behavioral plan, do you mean behavioral intervention plan? What behavioral plan do you mean? Because
Yeah,
I
so
seem to be a huge confusion among staff and parents, you know?
yeah, so there's behavior intervention plans. I think they're I mean, we've called them BIPs. So they've been referred to as positive behavior intervention plans. And ultimately what they're looking at are, I mean, typically when you're looking at one of those in its purest form, there's some sort of individualized behavior that's happening. So we'll take me, for example, like if I was struggling in math, I might begin exhibiting the behavior of escaping math every day by misbehaving, right? If I've figured out that like I misbehave in math and Mr. Smith sends me to the office, cool, I just escape math. If I do that again and again and again, I now have a behavior in place to escape math, right? And I've worked with a bunch of teams on this, and they were like, Mr. Smith's like, every time I ask Johnny to do math, he throws his book or he leaves. I'm like, well, then don't ask him to do math. And I get laughed at because I'm like, well, if the trigger is asking him to do math, let's come up with something different. That's the first thing we can do. Ultimately, it's your hand. Or we can ask Johnny, like, like politely say, I don't want to do my math. And it's like, okay, cool. You didn't throw your book. Like, depending on the severity of the behavior, we have to take steps to get back towards the I guess the expected response. And ultimately the goal is like, yeah, Johnny's doing his math in Mr. Smith's class, no issues. So the tier 3 support around that is that behavior support plan. Now, the one thing I'll say about this looks really neat. It looks like paint by numbers on here, like, oh, now it's a tier 2 support, now it's a tier 3 support. It's more like watercolors, really, because the idea is like, okay, we have this intensive behavior intervention plan, but like, okay, it's working. How do we fade from it? Like, we don't need to use it with such intensity, or we can fade to like a tier 2 support, or I think the chat's been going, I saw like check in, check out, which is a classic tier 2 support for students who are exhibiting some behavior or attention-seeking behavior, right? It's a way to program program attention into their day that allows for like the pro-social or the positive way of supporting it.
Okay, this is Yana. Can I just ask a quick question about this? Because if a student is avoiding math or any other subject, wouldn't that be a signal that there might be suspected disability, and therefore the district should evaluate for need for special education and or related services?
Not always. No, I would say like there's students who definitely avoid math, not necessarily because of disability, but there may have been knowledge gaps and or previous lack of success with math. So
Well, I'm asking because I know that my kid avoided ELA because of writing. So because he's so smart that he figured it out. So, and there is a severe disability in that area. So, and we see it a lot. So I think, I guess at what point would we look at it as like, we're going to do tier 2 versus evaluate for special ed, that it just seems such a gray area here.
Yeah, so one of the things in about like 6 slides, we'll talk about that dual discrepancy model, this idea that like if a student's having like you look at something, okay, a student's escaping, and you do an evaluation, not a special education evaluation, but you look at the data and you're looking at like, okay, why is the student escaping this? Like, it could be they don't like the teacher, right? Like, let's rule out all the pieces. That could be the environment. It could be anything. But if it's like, okay, cool, actually, they have a lagging skill in math, we're going to try an intervention, right? If the intervention is working and they're beginning to pick up that math skill, cool. That's what we want to have, and we want to do these things as soon as possible. And that's where this idea behind a tier 2 intervention comes in, right? Tier 2 interventions are the idea, like. We have some of the classic ones set up. We have some behavioral interventions. We have some academic interventions. Schools set these up ahead of time, and they're looking for students to plug into them quickly so that they can reduce the amount of time a student's in the intervention. They can close gaps quicker, and they can provide with those core supports, right? So tier 2, I like to think of like you have the machine set up. You're looking for students every day to plug into these interventions. Tier 3, you're like, holy cow, we've tried some things, or there's some unique situations going on, and we need to design an intervention for the student. So it's tier 2, you're looking for the students. Tier 3, you're looking for the intervention. So, that's some of the pieces behind the tier there. And again, like I said, it's it's not paint by number, it's watercolor, and it's locally determined. So alternative school that I taught at, like what we were like core supports, like included like counseling for most of the students just because of their history, because of their needs. Tier 3 was more intensive than the comprehensive high school in the district, just because the students who were there were usually credit deficient, they were a little bit behind, life circumstances had them out of school, their attendance wasn't great at the comprehensive school, and now they're looking for some credit recovery. So our academic and behavioral supports were a bit more intense across the continuum. So I'm gonna skip my joke about the fish tank, but that it in the piece, and I've said this a few times, and I see a lot of things in the chat, and I'll make sure that I address them. But the one thing I want to focus on is this idea that the continuum of supports is not a deficit model. Okay, it's not just a deficit model, right? It's not just like, okay, we're only supporting students who don't have the skill set yet or have emerging skill sets, and we're trying to catch them up. This is true for students who show up and they're like, they burn through the curriculum so quickly, like, oh, okay, now like I need to keep Johnny engaged, like I need to help him advance his learning. There might be some tier 2 and tier 3 individualized supports that Johnny or Sally, and sorry, I'm just using like typical names, that they need to keep them engaged, right? So we may have to look at something in addition to the core supports to help keep them engaged and maximize their learning in school, okay? So what's the strongest fish? The fish tank joke.
Well,
So
now you kind of threw us this like a little bit of information, and now we're really curious about the fish tank joke, but feel free to say it or not.
okay, this is not my fish tank. I don't. This credit goes to one of our coaches who works in Yakima. His point, and this is his analogy. Like his point was like, okay, you have this fish tank, and like in the corner you can see these fish down there, but this fish tank looks disgusting, right? You can take the fish out of it, and you can give them some vitamins, some clean water, get them all healthy again. But if you put them back in this fish tank, they're going to end up sick and struggling again, right? I see Eric's doing that, like, yeah, like we're going to intervene. So this goes to the idea of you can't provide an intervention for something you're not addressing at the core level, right? So you can't intervene your way out of poor core, is what we say. So if you're not teaching phonics, or you don't have any phonics-based like language instruction in tier 1, you can't expect that you're going to provide a phonics tier 2 support and then have the student go back to the classroom and thrive, right? Like if it's not reinforced, you're not generalized, it's not going to work. So it's this idea of like you need to constantly be looking at the health of the system. So I think Eric, you had asked about how do you know that you have that 80% threshold, right? So as a team, as a building team, you're looking at the interventions and the supports you have in place, and you're looking at, okay, how many tier 2 interventions do we have? Like, oh my gosh, we have like 40% of our students accessing tier 2. Time out. We've all got to do something different at tier 1 to support all students. So when you look at just the sheer numbers of students accessing tier 2 supports, that's when it's a timeout from a systems perspective, but you're not going to stop supporting them. Like, don't think I'm saying that like, all right, you 20% are off. Like, no, it's when you, as a school implementation, like a building team, you look say, hey, we've got to look at this and do something a little bit more robust at tier 1. So you take a look at what you're doing at tier 2, you look at like, okay, here's the theme that we're addressing, like across so many different interventions. We need to boost that part of our instruction at tier 1, or that part of our support. So if you see, and the same thing with behavior, right? So if you see like 40% of your students are engaging in a higher level of attention-seeking behavior, timeout, we're all going to do something different to sort of like overload providing students attention at tier 1. So, and then that allows you to look at the more intricate pieces of tier 2.
Time check, 5 minutes.
Yep. So special education and MTSS. There is no tier 4, right? And special education does not live in tier 3. So when we talk about this idea of specially designed instruction, it exists across the continuum. right? I could be receiving my specially designed instruction in the general education classroom. It doesn't mean that everything about my IEP or my individualized education plan is individualized. It's a composite of a bunch of different interventions that are put together because of my unique needs based on my disability, right? So it looks at like, okay, this is what we've done. Looked at all the data. We looked at how I performed. We looked at the impact of my disability on my education. And in this local setting, here's what we've put together to be the most successful for me. And we're gonna have goals for it and we're gonna track it, right? MTSS is not a special education initiative. It's for all students. So like people are like, oh, like we have 14% of our students in the district receiving special ed services. You said there's only 5 in tier 3. Is it because special ed isn't tier 3, right? It's everywhere. It's a composite of supports. And MTSS supports that inclusionary model, right? So when I said that it's specially designed instruction, that's important to remember, because if we think about it, that doesn't mean it's specially delivered instruction, right? So it's the special education teacher, the special education staff have to be part of that design of it. But if it's an intervention that a general education teacher can provide, you want that being provided in the general education classroom, right? There are times when there has to be there are probably specific skills that have to be taught, not necessarily in isolation, but in a more intensive and deliberate manner. But the goal should always be for the student to be able to generalize and apply those across settings, right? They should be able to provide them, or they should be able to sort of exhibit those skills in a general education setting, or in a post-secondary world is ultimately the goal. So it's clear that it's specially designed instruction, not necessarily delivered. Those tiers describe the intensity of that support, right? So we don't have tier 3 students, we don't have tier 2 students, we have students who need, like in their IEP, are receiving a composite of universal supports depending on local context, and tier 2 and tier 3 supports to address their specific need based on their disability. Okay. And it's not, so it doesn't, the tiers don't describe the person who gets the supports or who's delivering them, and that it's contextual. So I keep saying, like, depending on what the school or the district is providing at core, what looks like a tier 2, tier 3 intervention may be different. Case in point, when I was working in district, we had a student who came in, they were in a self-contained setting prior to coming into our district, right? We sat down as a team, and the principal was freaking out. They were just like, no, we don't have a self-contained setting. I was like, well, I'm looking at the set of supports that are here, and we can provide that without being self-contained. I don't know what the structure was, and it was out of state. I don't know what it was in that other district, but I was looking at, like, here's what we do. We provide this in our setting. It looks different here because our continuum of supports is different. However, it says student needs A, B, and C. We can do that. The setting is just different. So met with the family, met with the student, and we provided, like, we rewrote the IEP to match the context for where the student was. So that's why I say context matters all the time, like, because District A is not the same as District B. Like, there will be a lot of similarities, but they're not the same. They have to follow the same rules of the state, but what it looks like, the structures are not always the same. And school A is not the same as school B, even in the same district. And I know some of you have heard about 2028 SLD qualification change is happening. This all, to put it most simply, this is to maximize the ability for us as teams to intervene early, provide that support for the student, rather than saying like, oh no, wait, they don't qualify yet, and not do anything to support the student. What this does is it gets rid of this discrepancy, this severe discrepancy, right? It says, like, basically, like, no, we're not going to use a cognitive battery and academic battery and wait 2 years for the student to fall behind before we provide them with special education services. We're just getting rid, like, ultimately as a state, we're getting rid of that pathway to qualification. There has always been an RTI, so that academic MTSS framework. There's always been that in place in the academic code in the state to, and in IDA to, as a pathway toward special education qualification under a specific learning disability. We had talked about this idea of the dual discrepancy, right?
We're
This is
at
where like,
time, but this is Yana, we're gonna ask people if they can stay for a few more minutes. We have to ask the interpreter if she can stay for a few more minutes. Because if we don't have an interpreter, we might need to be done, but Crystal, could you give us another 5 minutes or so? Yes, thank you so much. Okay, we can continue for a couple more minutes, but then we're gonna try to see if we could approve the votes that we discussed earlier in the meeting. I'm sorry, we're trying
no worries.
because the session isn't, the legislative session is going already, so we're a little behind.
So one of the things that's coming up in a lot of states as they've gotten rid of their severe discrepancy is there's been litigation around districts using MTSS as a way to delay a special education evaluation. So I think every single case has said you can't do that. And I am in agreement with that. Like, you should not be. Like, if you suspect there's a disability, begin that process of looking at it, right? Like that's if I were in a role to advise teams, and that's not my job at OSPI, but if I was in a role to advise teams, I'd be like, if you suspect it, like, look at it. Like the student who needs some support. If it's early on, you're like, oh, no, hold on a minute, like we're providing an intervention. But if you see these things where you see like, all right, there's inadequate achievement, right? So their level of performance, the gap is not closing even with the intervention, or this insufficient progress, like they're not progressing the way a student would based on the evidence, the body of evidence that supports this intervention. If you see this, you're like, time out, we've got to suspect something else is going on, right? You have to rule out the idea of like wrong intervention, like, oops, like if it was behavior, like, I mean, in the world of behavior, like we thought it was attention seeking, but it was escape, like wrong intervention. So you have to rule that out, and you have to rule out the idea that someone wasn't trained to do the intervention, right? So it has to be an evidence-based practice. So that means it has to be used like on label for the reason it was designed, and by trained staff. So it has to be done with what we call fidelity, right? You have to be sure that you're doing it the right way and for the right reason. So if we see these things where it's either that inadequate achievement or that insufficient progress, that's when sort of like the asterisk goes up and it's like, okay, hold on a minute, we've got to look at perhaps learning disability here. And that's what current guidance that's being reviewed and written and should be coming out from the state in the next few months gets at, is like how districts and schools should go about this process of no longer using severe discrepancy and looking at like this response to intervention model where we quickly see like, okay, student has like, we're seeing a lagging skill set, we need to provide an intervention. Cool, student made progress, intervention worked. Or students not making progress, intensify, looking at like, okay, are we seeing these inadequate achievement or insufficient progress? We have to then begin to suspect learning disability, and we would consider that special education evaluation process then. But like I said before, we can't use this RTI or this MTSS process as a way to say like, no, we're not going to do a special education evaluation. It can't be used to delay it in the event that we suspect that there's a disability. So that's what the guidance will clearly say, and it'll have those steps in there that for special education teams.
Do we know that when that's coming? Because it's been talked about for a while.
That is, so it has been written, and I will know that like while I work super close with our special education department, that most of my work is on the other side of special education now, looking at like the greater MTSS systems in the state. I did review quite a bit of it and provided some feedback. So basically a multi-department, multi-division agency writing team put it together. At OSPI, we reviewed it and had to make sure it aligned with existing laws and sent review back to the writing team, and they have it again to do some cleanup. So my understanding is it's going to be out in late spring is the last that I was told. So yeah, There are 5 technical assistance papers if you really want to sort of dig into that on our website, and I can I can follow up with you and you can share that out after if you don't already know where they are. But
I do know some of them, and we actually used some of them for our Did You Know a series a couple of years ago. We should probably do more, but we've got a little bit of a shortage of volunteers here.
And they're a good place to get started, but then the guidance will be a little bit more robust and it'll dig in a little bit deeper to some of the systems that we would expect districts to have in place. Yeah, and I'm trying to skim through the question. So back to the beginning, Eric, you had a question. BIP, yeah, behavior intervention plan, typically a tier 3 support at the public school level. However, in my former role, that was every student had a behavior plan. So sometimes it could be tier 2, depending on whether it's an alternative school, comprehensive, like it depends. But usually when we're talking about intervention plans, it's something in addition to what we're doing at core.
This is Yana. There is one question from Laura. In extreme situations, how quickly can support be worked on, provided for students, which see OSPI identified about 5%? It's pretty traumatic for everyone, including the student themselves, when they are having something's covering up, crisis for many days, but no support for anyone. I understand that public school has to provide education, but where is the line?
So how quickly?
Yeah. So we have a student in crisis and they're saying, well, it'll take 35 school days to evaluate. And first, we're going to take 6 weeks to try this response to intervention, and the student is in crisis and, 6 weeks or even 2 weeks can be too long.
Yeah. So I can use an example. So the district I used to work in, we had, like at the high school, I was supporting their tier 2 team, right? So weekly, they were looking at indicators for the interventions they had set up, and weekly they had students popping up, and it was like, okay, quick, let's make sure that student has access to this intervention. Again, like Devin said, it takes some time to set these things up. So like understand that like in the world of education, we're rebuilding the airplane as we're flying it through the sky, because P12 education was not set up for all students to begin with. So we're trying to readjust the system. But in a well-functioning MTSS framework in a building, within a week, an intervention should be able to be provided to a student. Unless, and this is where I'll put the asterisk, unless it's sort of like, oh, hey, like they need an intensive intervention, we don't yet know what it is. Obviously, we're going to the idea of like we need to keep the student safe, right? Depending on what the need is, and from there, then begin to look at like how do we support this student. So if it's behavioral, safety and student well-being is always going to come first before we look at adjusting behavior, right? So tier 2 interventions should be able to be literally next week, right? That's how it should be done. And I would say in a really great system by the end of the existing week, if you're depending on when the week your team is meeting. Tier 3, typically at this point, we're looking at multiple points of data and we're trying to put together a support for a student. So we're creating something that we don't have ready to deploy. We're pulling from evidence-based places, but we just don't have it to deploy right away. So it's going to naturally take longer to do it the right way for the student. To apply a specific timeline to that, I mean, I would imagine you should be doing something for a student in 2 to 3 weeks if it's that individualized. And if it's super intensive, like it might take longer, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you are working trying to find counseling for students outside of school, right? I mean, like that takes forever. And part of it is the shortage, but the idea is, and our efforts, like if we can maximize what we're doing around behavioral health, we have to do less for mental health because we can catch students sooner with their needs over time and prevent them from needing intensive supports for for needs that were not addressed over time. That's not to say that every student, there's students that pop up with acute needs that yes, you absolutely have to address as soon as possible. And that's where I think that we feel in the greater system, we feel that pull, because like, yes, we know the student needs this tomorrow and right now, but you turn and it's crickets sometimes because no one has time. Eric, I see your hand.
If I'm just trying to process what you just said with that. So let's say we do have a student that is in extreme need. MTSS is basically a system that's set up that there should be able to be some sort of intervention at each one of those tiers that might be able to be implemented at different timelines to be able to address the student. There could be some universal supports depending on what the school has right there. Maybe they have an on-site counselor, maybe they have one of several things that's universal to every student, yet something that's going to be more intensive, more long-term might have to be accessed at a tier 2 or tier 3. So like what you were saying, like a BIP for one school district might be a tier 3 or a tier 2, or might be everyone. So if you have a student that's in extreme need, there should be some tier 1 supports that should be readily accessed, like within that couple of days, with more intensive supports from that tier 2, tier 3 based on the district's resources, correct?
Yeah, so if we think about it from like a health model, right? So like a school is going to have a defibrillator in it, right? So it's not used hopefully it's not used every day. If it, like, so it's good, everyone has access to it, right? So that's an acute need individualized to that student right now because they're having a cardiac incident, right? Or a staff, like that treats the moment, right? Like the idea of like safety, like make sure everyone's okay. Later on, you find out like, okay, student has a cardiac, like a congenitive situation. Cool, not cool, sorry. Now cool from the standpoint of like, we have this information, like now we know what we can do from a preventative standpoint, and sort of like in the event that we see some of these markers from the student, we have interventions in place that they need specifically for them. So those acute needs typically pop up around behavior or behavioral health. Like we don't necessarily like, this can sound terrible, but we don't say like, oh my gosh, we have a computation crisis like for this student. Like we can see that there's like, typically we see those developing through grades as long as we're using data year to year to track how a student's progressing, and we can see like, oh hey, hold on a minute, like yeah, we're going to keep them in core instruction, and we got to make sure that like we're providing them with some computation support because we're seeing like this piece of their performance. So you're 100% right. Yeah, there should be sort of like those acute need supports available for everyone. That's in the moment, but that's not a long-term solution, right? We're not going to just follow that student around with an AED. We're going to come up with a plan to support them. So when I say like an intervention takes time to develop for a student, yes, but in the moment, we're going to like, yeah, we're going to do no harm, do the best thing we know to support them, to keep them safe. Trying to see, there was a question around a functional behavior assessment. No, you do not need to have an identified disability to for staff to do a functional behavior assessment. Actually, recent guidance from the office or from the Department of Education said that like that it's functional behavior assessments are typically used when you're not sure why the student is exhibiting the behavior they're exhibiting, and you do a kind of a large scale observation of different settings, different triggers to the behavior, and you come up with like basically a hypothesis as RJ typically engages in attention-seeking behavior when he's in science because of X, and here's our plan to do it. So it involves like FBAs or functional behavior assessments. It doesn't have to be a student who's already receiving special ed services or is being evaluated. They are necessary steps in, let me go back to special ed law. manifestation determinations. So looking at students who've been removed for whatever reason, you have to do, it's a step to look at like the behavior. Is their behavior a manifestation of their disability? Like, and it requires some very clear assessment. But no, you don't have to have a documented disability. And I would say that I think they're overused. I think there are a lot more preventative things we can do from that technical assistance standpoint to educate everyone around function-based thinking around behavior versus like waiting and being like, I don't know what's going on. It's like, well, all right, pause, take a look at like you said X, student did this. Are they escaping or are they looking for attention? Like use your like best educator guess, like, all right, seems to be attention. Provide them with or front load it with attention so they're not seeking it out in a different way. So so I think, yeah, so FBAs don't have to be you don't have to have they're for like anyone can have an FBA done on them as long as it's appropriate to look at the behavior.
So this is Yana. I am so sorry. We're going to have to
Yeah.
close. We are running 16 minutes late past our meeting time. And this is very interesting. I think we could have had a 2.5-hour conversation here easily. So maybe we might talk about how much more time we can steal from RJ going forward at some point, maybe a repeat or do some other engagement. But thank you all for being here. And RJ, would it be okay if people who didn't get to ask their questions, because, you know, sometimes the questions come in later as other questions are being asked, would they be okay to email to you and get a response? Or if individuals want to email to you, or would you like us to email you? How would you?
Yeah, I put my email in the chat. I will say I will do my best to turn around and answer questions, or Yana, if you wanted to collect them. It is the middle of legislative session, so
We
while
know.
there is sort of an expectation that if a legislator says like, hey, I have a question, it's like it's an end of day answer, and sometimes it involves dropping everything. So I will do my best to respond in time. A better practice might be on if you collected the questions, I could set some time around and address them in sort of one fell swoop.
This is Yana, no problem. We will collect them. And I'm going to try to, you can email me at president@Seattle Special Education PTSA.org to check in a few weeks of whether we've gotten responses back. But, you know, we are also involved in legislative advocacy and all kinds of, you know, district level advocacy. So we totally understand, RJ, and we just appreciate you being here and clarifying some of these very muddy waters for us. I will ask members if they could stay for just 5 minutes because of the urgency of the legislative session. The legislative priorities need to be approved. It helps us advocate with legislators. So RJ, I really appreciate you being here. We all do. And have a good night and we can connect later. Otherwise, Mel, did you want to take off? We need to make sure first that we have 10 people here so we don't go over things, over the legislative priorities without having a quorum here. So if people could, yeah, we're having people leave. But if you are a member, please raise your hand or stay. We're gonna, okay. So let's see, 1, 2, 3. Eric, are you a member? And if you're not, would you like to be a member?
I'm not currently, no, but I was looking at it.
Okay.
Wasn't sure if I met all the qualifications.
Well, member,
Just a community
qualification
member.
is you are interested in being a member. And unless you were a school district administrator who wouldn't be able to vote on certain things, then like vote for our positions, then, you know, otherwise you are qualified. But The give backs, if somebody could put it back in, and do we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Oh, okay. Let's see. That disappeared because somebody shared. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Kate, I think. Kristen, I think we have 10. Kristen, are you there still?
I'm here still. I don't know if my membership is current.
Yes, it is. I know because I was because we don't have a membership share, so I was looking up some stuff. And playing all the different instruments at the same time. So so I think if Eric, we're gonna kind of like pressure him to join so we can approve legislative priorities. I don't know. Were you here? No. So if somebody wants to count with me, because I don't count, I can't vote as a chair, right? So
But aren't you part of the quorum though?
I am part of the quorum, but
Okay.
if we have, oh yeah, right, correct. Thank you, Sherlyn.
Uh-huh.
So I'm going to stop recording because we don't have space on Zoom account. Okay, so
I
Mel,
think we have it already.
3,
Perfect.
4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah.
I think we do. So Mel, go ahead and
Can we repeat the previous motion first and put that one through since you've already read all the stuff?
so we're gonna vote on those
Standing rules.
rules that we talked about, and Mel made a motion to approve, and Laura Marie seconded. So if we could get all of your hands down, so just for you to get them up in a second. So all in favor of approving the standing rule amendment as we discussed earlier in the meeting, please.
Do you want it in the chat or hands up or what do you
Well,
want? Lynn?
I think since it's a very small group now, I think you can just raise your hand or
Okay.
little thumbs up or whatever. And
excuse me, I'm sorry, I can't see how to raise a hand, but
it's
this is
okay.
Kate.
If you're raising your hand vocally, that's
Yeah,
supposed
this
to.
is Kate Parrish and I vote yes. And I just joined.
Oh, thanks, Kate.
Thank
Oh.
you.
Fantastic. Welcome. So, all right, all in favor. I know that Tamara's not, I don't think Tamara's are, but I know who she is. And then Angie, I don't think is, but otherwise, I think we have
1, 2,
Laura Gramer. Are you
3, 10, yeah.
in favor of approving our standing rules, or you can abstain as well?
Eric joined.
All right.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Sometimes it's hard to get people to come, we all have a full plate, right? Okay. I think there's something in the chat, so.
Tamara joined as well.
Tamara joined. Thank you. Thank you for helping us out. Call us when you need to approve some. It's hard. Those are, yeah, that just makes our life easier. Thank you. So do I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,
There's 10.
9, 10. Okay, so the motion passes. Thank you. All right, now Mel. This is a rush.
Okay. So we're gonna go through this. Pretty is it?
1 second. I think we can let Crystal go.
Okay.
I just noticed that Crystal's still here hanging out with us. Apologies, Crystal. Thank you for being here. We will free you now. And thank you so much. Oh, I'll talk to her later. Okay.
My screen.
Take it away.
I think there we go. Okay.
It'll only take less than 5 minutes, guys.
Is this readable? It's looking really small on my side. Here. Can you guys see that? Like, is it big on your screen? It looks teeny on mine. I'm on my phone, so.
It looks fine to me.
Okay, good.
It's good. Oh, wait, it went away. It looked so good, I move we adopt it.
Second.
No, we need to review then. Sorry.
I tried.
I can also share if that's, if that helps. Oh, nope, not this.
Can someone just read it even without it being shared?
Yeah. Mel? Hello? Did we just lose her?
I think we lost her.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
well,
what had happened.
gonna take it
It,
then.
it shut down when we lost her.
Can you pull it back up and we'll get her back on to vote?
Yep. So,
I could probably go over it even if it was.
well, I could too, but
A
I'm
minute.
looking for it's in the, I'm trying to get the link to work and it's not working for some reason. Oh, Mel is back. Love this intermittent signal too. We have you back.
Okay, so let me try that one more time. I'm going to go to this. It's easier now that I have my.
Would you like me to share?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, because I'm.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
thinking it's
thank
hard to
you.
present when you're
I have it up like somewhere around here, but I just.
totally fine. Totally fine.
Or maybe it's not on here because I was on my phone.
It's super hard to do on your phone. I will say. Okay, here we go. So, can people see
There we
this?
go. Okay, so these are our legislative priorities. These have been developed over the years by our members. Years come, years go. It's a very detailed list of all the issues that families with students with disabilities may run up against or have special interests in or are vested in. And we have gone through them. I'm not going to read them all again. There's not time for that, correct? So I'm just going to go through the edits that we're making to them, that we're proposing to them. We're going to be changing the funding cap to 16%. And hopefully next time we'll be deleting it altogether. But that for this time, we're changing it to 16%. And we are adding is this an trauma-informed practices?
Well, I'll just say that it's because the cap used to be at 15%, then it got
Right.
moved to 16%, and we really don't want the cap, but we need to update what it is right now. That's all.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay, and we are adding and resources here on this sentence. Access to mental health services for students with disabilities and their families, providing wraparound support and resources. Our next is to remove, this was a double, wait, go up, Yana.
Whoop.
Because this one is being deleted, the assist families with access to resources, that adding the add resources deleted that sentence right there, that bullet right there.
Yes.
And I think that's it.
There was the burden of proof.
Oh, where is that one? Yes. Oh, where is it?
Or maybe you already deleted it.
I don't know. No, I didn't touch it. No, I didn't do that. Interesting.
But we are deleting the burden of proof to be shifted to the school districts, and that bill passed last year. So maybe, I don't know, maybe this draft already doesn't have it. I don't know. But otherwise
Oh, yeah. So those are the changes that
Yep.
we're proposing.
Yep. So the changes are shown. The removal is just verbal. Yeah. All right. So anybody has any questions?
Any questions? Yes.
Okay. So if I can have a motion.
I move that we vote to approve.
That
I
was?
second. Oh, was that Tamara?
That was Kristen.
Sorry. And Laura Marie seconds.
Kristen moves, Laura Marie seconds. Okay, all in favor. I'm gonna stop sharing because otherwise I can't see anybody.
Question over from Laura Rose.
All right, Laura Rose, go ahead. We're just going.
Was your
I
hand
don't
up
have a
to
question.
vote?
I'm voting.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
Jumped the gun.
Okay, so What's the question? No.
No question.
No question. Hands are up to vote right now.
All right, so all in favor, please say, raise your hand. Don't say anything, just say raise your
Raise
hand.
the roof, raise the roof.
Yeah, unless you can't raise your hand, then just let us
I'd
know.
say
Yep,
it's passing.
yes. All right.
Yes.
So
Awesome.
the motion passes. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Woo! Good night.
Good night, guys.
Thank
We
you
got
all.
it.
It's a long one. Check, chickadee. Check.
Yeah, I'm finding, as exhausting as we thought these long meetings were. Oh, meeting is adjourned, sorry. And so we had them 2-hour meetings and we shortened it to an hour and a half in the interest of our stamina as well as interpretation cost. We are actually not saving on interpretation cost anyway.
My retinas, my eyeballs are so puffy.
Yeah, but some meetings are just long, and especially if we have a really good presentation, right? Like, I don't know about you guys, but I still have like 7 different questions for RJ.
Yeah.
I didn't want to pick his brain. So, all right, thanks for being here and getting the business done.
Awesome.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Save. All righty, so. That was, where's this? Where was this damn thing? Oh, here we go. No. Save chat.